Welcome back, everybody. Now, PwC's Global Economic Crime and Fraud Survey 2022 revealed that 46% of organizations have experienced fraud, corruption or other economic crimes in the last 24 months. Now, this morning, we are unpacking some of the fraud trends that CFOs should be on the lookout for. And to take this conversation further, we are now joined in studio by CEO of Eftsure, Ryan Mer. A very good morning to you, Ryan. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Good morning, Samperia. Thanks very much for having me here.
I mean, what would you attribute the rise in cybercrimes to?
I think that we have entered an era of digital transformation, and with that comes essentially digital attacks on businesses. Yeah. We also are going through tougher economic times in general, not just in South Africa, but globally. And, that leads people, to take different measures in terms of how to get money, essentially. Also with that, sorry to interrupt over there, but just with that, comes the concept that businesses in general, and that's certainly the place where we play as Eftsure, as a B2B solution, businesses in general, we have seen have not quite kept up pace with this digital transformation when it comes to digitizing internal controls and processes.
Okay. So from what you've observed, who is the most affected? Is it individuals or businesses?
It's definitely a combination of both, but businesses are huge targets for payment fraud, certainly with cybercrime, because they're paying out all the time, every day, large sums.
So why do you think they haven't kept up with the anti-cybercrime crusade or efforts?
I think people are sometimes slow to react. There's a mentality that I do have controls in place, but unfortunately what we find most of the time is that those controls are very manual and reliant on people. And at the end of the day, people can be manipulated and people can manipulate. And when it comes to cybercrime and payment fraud, it's a combination not just of cyber technical attacks, but very much so of manipulating people in the process.
What are some of the common fraudulent activities that we have experienced?
So I think from certainly from a business perspective, you've got sort of two aspects to it. You've got external cybercrime related fraud, which are essentially big syndicates, bad actors who are trying to defraud businesses, intercept payments. But unfortunately, every business also faces the risk of internal fraud as well, where people internally are, manipulating information and controls to perpetrate payment fraud or are complicit with external people in that.
And ideally, if someone gets defrauded, who should be held responsible?
So when you look at a business, let's start with within a business. Yeah. Your CFO in a business is ultimately responsible for the financial assets of that business and for the processes and controls relating to safeguarding those financial assets. Yes. So they certainly have a huge responsibility within the business to protect against this. Once a fraud occurs, well, we've seen, recently some, court rulings and precedent that's out there that ultimately is holding, firstly, a business that is making payment out, responsible for making sure that that payment actually reaches the intended recipient. But even more recently, we've seen something very interesting where one of the largest law firms in the country was involved in a property transaction, and they essentially gave their banking details to a consumer to transfer funds for that transaction. That email got intercepted, those details got changed, and it was the law firm that was held responsible for that incoming payment.
Really?
Yeah, and so that's pretty big, because what you're really just seeing here with that ruling is a precedent that is saying businesses can no longer play ignorance in relation to the severity of business email compromise and payment fraud. They need to be taking it seriously and implementing the appropriate controls, procedures, and safeguards, security safeguards, to make sure that these things don't happen.
And why are manual processes so dangerous?
So, manual processes ultimately rely on people. It relies on human decision-making and human activity. Yes. And, what we find is, as I suggested earlier, people, unfortunately, are susceptible to manipulation, and they can manipulate. And, so you want to take as much of the human input in that process out as possible, to rely as little on people in that, because at the end of the day, people are people have bad days, and when it comes to tough economic times, desperate times tend to call for desperate measures, even within people who wouldn't be doing what they ordinarily maybe would do.
Yeah. And what are some of the red flags that companies should look out for, just to protect themselves from being a victim of cybercrime? I mean, you just mentioned this big law firm that was defrauded. How should that company have prevented that fraudulent transaction? So
again, I think it starts at the top, firstly, of the organization. It starts with a culture of attitude towards cybercrime and payment fraud, filtering into education within the organization, and that is an ongoing thing, constantly educating and reminding staff members around the risks involved with this, the fact that it is very real, that people need to be alert and vigilant, not click on links in emails, not when people are calling them to change banking details, and just do things that people need to act with a sense of a cautious attitude towards these sort of things. And then definitely they need to adopt technology to improve internal controls and processes. So they need to review internal controls and processes, and they need to look at how they can adopt technology to assist in that agenda.
What's even more worrisome is that every time technology, improves or is upgraded to some degree, even the criminals themselves, the cyber criminals themselves, keep on reinventing themselves to keep up with the trend. So is there any way that we could possibly clamp down on cyber criminals?
So, I mean, it's absolutely, look, make no mistake about it. Cybercrime is a very lucrative, and it's organized crime. So absolutely, they run those operations just like any business runs. And they are, constantly trying to stay one step ahead. And as companies, just like any security, whether it's physical or cyber kind of stuff, you've got to make sure that you are also trying to, adopt the latest technologies that you can to help mitigate that risk.
And what's also worrisome is that these cyber criminals, they hide behind legitimate, cyber or internet companies, eh?
Yeah, look, online identities is really a challenge.
Yeah.
Because that's, what we see is, I was asked the question, is cybercrime specific to South Africa? Absolutely not. Cybercrime is a global thing, and cyber criminals can sit anywhere in the world and attack, for example, businesses anywhere else in the world. So, they are sitting behind a computer at the end of the day, and it's very challenging to know who you're really dealing with.
And how can a country's leadership establish, a cyber awareness?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I think, again, I guess just the same as within an organization, how it's got to come from the top. From a country perspective, I think it's something that, again, should be acknowledged.
Okay.
Cyber crimes are quite difficult to sort of catch and prosecute because of the nature, as I said, of people being sitting behind computers essentially anywhere in the world. But I think certainly, putting appropriate task teams or setting up appropriate units to help and be able to track down these cyber criminals, prosecute, people at the end of the day. And
someone mentioned to me that, it's even more difficult to prosecute them as a result of the emergence of cryptocurrencies as well. But we're out of time, unfortunately, Ryan. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Sharing your thoughts with us.
Thank you very much for having me here.
Great stuff. Thank you. That was the CEO of Eftsure, Ryan Mer, and he's been speaking to us about some of the fraud trends that every CFO should be on the lookout for.